First seminar I'm going to cover here today, we're going to do a few little 10-minute seminars. And the first topic is going to be fertilizer carryover. In 2023, we've been experiencing severe drought in the upper Midwest, into the transition zones a little bit. And so many people planted your spring perennials, soybeans, four galore, warm season annuals. In a lot of places, you either saw failure or stunted growth. So there's a topic here that we wanted to cover that most people don't hear about, think about. So whether you're using a dry program or a liquid program, if you're using a dry program for perennials, maybe you're using 100, 150 pounds an acre of 624, 24, 9, 23, 30, along with 1 to 200 pounds an acre of straight potash. If you put that down at planting, and you had very little growth, you had very little utilization of those fertilizers. And so there's a number of people I've been working with that saw really poor establishment. Maybe weeds took over because weeds tended to handle the drought a lot better. So what we've seen, and I've even done this on one of my research properties, is we wiped out 5 of the blocks of the perennial blends for different reasons. We had some Pennsylvania smartweed creeped in. Weeds way too high above threshold, and so we decided to start over, do a fall planting. So no matter if you use dry fertilizer, liquid fertilizer, we have a lot of fertilizer that's been laying in the soil. So anything that's had a lot of nitrogen may or may not be gone. It depends on if it's sitting on top of the soil, or with no rain it's gone. If it's lightly incorporated into the soil, worked in, whether it be dry or liquid, some of that could still be there. And so you had very little growth, poor growth. What that means is you would have had very little utilization of those fertilizers. So they're there, you've already applied them. So if you're gonna come back and replant, no matter what you're gonna replant, whether it's like one of the Grandpa Ray's fall blends, maybe you're gonna come back in and reestablish your Clover Craze Elite, Mass Builder Gold, maybe you're gonna try again. So if you already put a third rate or half weight down in the spring, that phosphorus and potassium doesn't migrate. That's still there. So you already got some goodies, some nutrients, some groceries there. And so what I would do is then just plant, and then 3 to 5 weeks after planting, then come back in with that other half, if you put half down before planting. If you only put about a third of rate down in the spring, what I think I would do then is, we got to kill weeds most likely before planting, wait 7 to 14 days, probably put that second third of the nutrients down at that point, and then come back 3 to 5 weeks after planting and hit it up with that last third, that last 1.5, 1.6 gallons per acre for on a liquid program. If you're on a dry program, if you put a third to half down in the spring pre-plant, then let's go back at planting and put the rest down of whatever's needed based on your own situation, and that's where I come in to help you guys. So again, we've seen this many years ago. I forgot what year it was. One of the guys sitting here today, we brought up the drought maybe 12 years ago, and I was at a seminar, agronomy event, and this was one of these topics that was discussed. So and again, that's came up this year. I wanted to convey this to people. It's like, well, strategy. I mean, some of these nutrients can be carrying over till next year. Let's just say, depending on the levels you put down, as I said, phosphorus and potassium tend to not migrate much. They tend to stay, closer to the zone. There's some exceptions. I mean, if you got pure sand ground, I mean, tend to have more migration. But if you got peat or loam or clay, we tend to stay in the zone. And if guys are also using the liquid or dry humic programs that I discuss a lot with my customer base, we tend to hold nutrients closer to the root zone because of that. So let's just say if you planted corn and you put a bunch of dry urea, or 28%, my 1149, and you got really stunted growth, which we've seen in some areas, and it's deemed that we just got to replant, we're not going to get a viable ears. And so what should you plant? Well, one consideration here is, what did you use for chemicals? And if you use any chemicals that we don't have a lot of carryover, that we can come back into the fall brassicas, same thing. It's like we already got, especially if you pounded quite a bit of dry urea or 1149 or 28%, we got a lot of those nutrients already there pre-plant. What I would consider doing is using grains and greens for us, like fall drought bulbs galore, one of the fall cocktail blends. And then we do burn down using, your 2,4-D. For those of you guys still use glyphosate, still use that 1.5 to 2 quarts an acre. For those of you guys that are not using glyphosate, use clethodim, 2,4-D, or Butyric 200, depending on the broadleaf you have. Some cases you could be using Liberty. And so basically then, about 3 weeks after planting, if you're on a liquid program, come back in with that 2.5 gallons of 1149. If you're staying on a dry program, then depending on how much nitrogen you put down on the corn, and if it was incorporated a gallon or if it's set on top of the ground, well, then we're not accounting for that. But let's go back in and put another application down of like your triple 18. Full rates on most fall brassicas typically is 200 to 300 pounds per acre of triple 18. Some people say, hey, I can't get triple 18, maybe whether it be triple 15, 17, 19. You're give or take around 300 pounds per acre typically to meet that 3-ton range of growth. But for some of you guys that are planting high yielding brassicas, which I'm selling a lot of brassicas that are growing 36, 42 inches tall versus the typical rakes that are 21 inches, the more growth you got, the more groceries you need to put on it. So again, that's one thing I could work with you guys as individuals to try to walk you through what, based on what you already put down. So stop and think about what you put down in the spring. Ponder how much yield you did have on what's growing at termination. And again, even if you had nutrient uptake on your corn, or maybe you had some really poor growing soybeans, maybe you had some perennials that grew but hardly at all, even if there was some nutrient uptake, when that dies back down, it will release back to the soil, but a lot of that you're probably not going to be getting utilized till 2024. So I'm a huge advocate for liquid programs. We had a little conversation before I started today with a couple people that are on all liquid program, and they were talking about a comparison between one of the neighbors even on corn and using a bunch of liquids and side-by-sides compared to foliar feeding with the program we're using, and looking at when we started getting response based on the rain and so on and so forth. I'm a huge fan of all liquid, and again, on years like this where you have all different types of weather across the U.S., but especially where we're talking with the drought conditions, you're not getting utilization of dry hardly at all, because you need moisture there and you need root development. And so this is a year that so many people I work with are seeing really good perennials that were either already established or maybe they got established earlier before the drought and got roots underneath of it, where we're seeing really good responses for the liquid program. And that's one of the things that I always bring up to guys, I'm bringing up again, is when you're on a dry program, how are you going to get those fertilizers into the plant? What conditions do you need to get them into the plant? And again, you need to have moisture, you need to have root development. And again, the liquid, is basically you're kind of circumventing the roots per se. We're not using roots as a nutrient capture device, we're using roots as a storage device. So when you're on a liquid program, as long as you have actively growing forages where you're able to spray on, it goes into leaves, rapidly it goes from the leaves all the way down to the roots, and then the roots become a storage unit versus the roots being a nutrient scavenger. We do want to still use those roots to bring up whatever nutrients are in the soil, but again, we're not just relying on the roots to bring nutrients in the soil. So this year in particular, we're seeing some really interesting things. This is a huge learning tool year for for fertilizers. And so as we will cover a little bit at another point, it was brought up as the Grandpa Race program has always been about handling Mother Nature. Never know what she's going to throw at you. She's been really dry so far this year, but a month from now we could be super wet. We could be going through prolonged periods of excess moisture, and then how can that affect your program? So we sell 16 different blends that are each of them diverse. Our blends always contain something that grows fast, something that tolerates dry, and something that tolerates wet. But even that being said, on your properties, I want most people to be planting 3, 4, 6 different blends. Your perennials, don't just rely on one perennial blend. your fall focus, don't just rely on one fall focus blend. Your warm season program, whether it be beans or corn or deer and bird or another warm season cocktail blend of sorts, we want to have a lot of diversity because, as an example again this year, I was bringing up is like one of the properties I managed, we had a lot more alfalfa, medium red clover, plantain, and chicory. Was looking outstanding before the drought hit. We wiped a bunch of that out to plant corn because we wanted to have more corn to make it into the winter. And again, this was one of those years that we can't go back. It's gone, and the areas where the alfalfa and the medium red clover are still there, they still handled that really well during the drought. And so that's why we got products like Gold and Elite there that can grow really well from the north all the way down into Florida. Because there's a lot of areas across the U.S. that every year they tend to be dry. And also the weather trends have been, the last number of years, Kansas, Missouri, across in the areas all the way across into Tennessee and that, we've had some really more drier than usual years. And so we almost got to count on it. So, I mean, no matter where you're at, we almost need to count on there being a drought. We almost need to count on there being possible prolonged periods of wet. And so when it comes to planting strategy, maybe you're not all buying into an all liquid program. So at least consider this. Using a dry fertilizer as a starter in that case, putting half rates down depending on the crop at planting, and then 3 weeks, 4 weeks after planting, come back and a foliar apply, no matter what the crop is, of liquid. So even if you get some initial early growth, and then you start seeing a stunning out effect, which we did this year, those nutrients go into the plant really rapidly. We don't have that 7 to 21, or even this year with the prolonged periods of drought, there's nutrients sitting there that were not utilized, they're maybe still not being utilized, but for sure they weren't utilized for 5 weeks. And again, even if you start getting a rain, there's still a little bit of a delay effect. So there's nutrients there that probably have been sitting out there 6, 7 weeks that are just finally starting to be getting utilized. Versus if you liquid applied, foliar fed, a number of weeks ago, at least those nutrients are getting in the plant and hopefully keeping them growing decently or preventing them from being as stressed out. So a few talking points in regard to fertilizers, fertilizer carryover, and again, almost everybody's got carryover that you're going to need that you can account for this fall on any of these failure areas that you plant in the spring or early summer. John O'Brien, Grand Prairie Outdoors.